Hello, this is John Majori with MajoriOnBowie.com. This is the MajoriOnBowie.com YouTube channel where I have an interview every week that has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, visit the blog, www.majorionbowie.com. And while you're here, hit like and subscribe so you get an update about whatever interview that I'm posting every week. And this week, I have a particularly special interview with a woman who, although we have never met, I believe is a woman after my own heart, Hannah Breschard. Hannah is a distinguished writer, editor, and influential figure in the music journalism landscape. She entered the public eye, unbeknownst to her, at the age of 16 when she appeared in a 1975 BBC documentary called Crack Actor, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Following her early exposure, Hannah channeled her passion for music into a prolific career in journalism. She was an editor at Rock and Super Rock magazine, which we're also going to talk about, and contributed to numerous rock music publications. And she's conducted interviews that I'm very jealous of, including with iconic artists such as Lou Reed, Iggy Pop, and Patti Smith, and many others. In recent years, Hannah has remained an active participant in the music community. This year, she was involved with the David Bowie World Fan Convention, where she served as a moderator and a panelist. Currently, she's compiling a memoir that promises to offer a rich tapestry of her recollections and adventures within the music world. Hannah's enduring contributions to music journalism and her firsthand experience with legendary artists continue to resonate, offering valuable insights into cultural movements that have shaped contemporary music. So Hannah, thank you and welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to hire you to say that anytime I walk into a brand new room of people, because I'm very impressed.
Done. So I'm so delighted that we're here. We have the chance to talk. So I have to get started with the question I was going to ask you. So what is it that everybody remembers from Crack Actor? What did you say, and what's the story?
Well, let me lead up to the story perhaps, and then I'll say the famous line. So I was the biggest Bowie fanatic in my community of Tucson, Arizona. And I was following David Bowie for almost 2 years by the time he showed up at the Diamond Dogs concert, which is a legendary concert. It was only in America. And halfway through the concert, it was like a rock opera kind of thing. He had a set called Hunker City, and it was a very exciting production. And halfway through, they realized that the production was too expensive to carry all over the United States. And probably that's why it didn't tour Europe and other places. But it did come to my hometown, and it was not sold out. But I was probably one of the first people who bought a ticket. And because I mean, he was everything to me. He still is plenty to me, but at that time he was absolutely everything. He was my sanity. He was my soul. He was my grace. He was my curiosity. He was my education. He was everything. And so I went to the concert, and I just had to get his eye. That was what I was thinking. So I hung out by the stage door. People were chasing us away. I did everything. And I go into full detail in my book of how my friend and I tried to get his attention. And during intermission, there was an opening act called a flamenco type music. They were a band called Carmen, who were also produced by Bowie's very famous producer, Tony Visconti. And they performed. And I had seen them just recently before that on the 1980 floor show that David Bowie had only in America. It was a midnight special.
Yeah.
And we all looked forward to that, of course. And so I was familiar with their music, but I still was hanging by the side door. And at one point, the door opened, and I did catch a glimpse of Bowie. And I caught his eye, and he stared at me. And I thought I was going to die at that point, but I didn't. I didn't die. Instead, I went into the crowd. And during the intermission, there was a film crew of about 3 people. Turns out it was BBC director Alan Yentob, and a camera person and a mic person, and that's how I remember it. And they were talking to people in the concert, people who were clad as wildly as I was, and they approached me, and they started to ask me questions. And some of the questions were actually included in the cracked actor documentary. They told me they were doing a film on Bowie, and he had seen me, is what they said. I don't know if that's true or not, but they said he had seen me and would like me in the movie. And I died my second death. And of course, I knew that if Bowie was ever going to see me and know who I was, I had to make an impression. So they asked me some questions like how old I was and where I was from and so on and so forth. And then they asked me what it was about David. And I said he was my fantasy. And then they said, well, what's your fantasy? They elaborated. And he was very kind looking. So, I mean, I had to think of something. So I said, well, excitement, space. And then I said my famous line, which was, see, I'm just a space cadet and he's the commander. And so that's what happened. And then it became a thing that I didn't even know about till about close to 10 years later.
So it became a thing. I and you could correct me if I'm wrong, especially in England, where people saw
Yes,
the documentary on the BBC.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. It was never
And
shown in America to this day.
to this day, okay.
Yes.
And at that time, there wasn't a YouTube or there weren't DVDs that you could get.
Right. Now
So
you can, but
yeah.
yes, at the time you could not.
So that line and that moment has become really iconic. And I'm going to ask you a couple questions about it. But I recently interviewed the artist Mark Wardell, who
Yes.
mentioned, I didn't tell him I was going to talk to you, and he mentioned that there's two lines that people remember from that documentary. The one is "There's a fly in my milk," and the other is your line. And I wanted to ask you, he illustrated a book about the documentary, and did he paint you? Like, is that moment so important to
Yes,
the
he
document?
did.
Yeah,
I'm the centerfold. I have two. He did me double.
yeah.
That
Did you
was
get to
before I
have
knew
a
it.
so and that clip has not just been used in the 1975 documentary, it's been used subsequently.
It's been used just about any time they mention David Bowie in a documentary or um, clip shows, things like that. I mean,
Yeah,
it's been quoted in an interview to David Bowie that David Bowie had with Boy George. It's been by Chris Hadfield of the International Space Station out in space, and he did record a version of Space Oddity.
yeah,
It's opened up film festivals here in Los Angeles that I know of. It was on every trailer of the Moon Age Daydream film that came out almost 2 years ago, maybe a
yeah,
year and a half ago, the one that Brett Morgan did.
yeah,
He also included me in the film, and David Bowie himself included it in a remaster or whatever you call it, a remix, excuse me, of
yeah,
his very famous song "Jump They Say," and I
yeah.
started off. Yeah, so it's been around. It's given me my Andy Warhol fame that I always desired.
I want to come back to the Bowie's use of the clip, but I want to ask you something else first.
Oh, sure.
So I've I've been writing about David Bowie since 2016, but I've been doing these interviews just starting this year, starting in February.
Congratulations, you're doing a good job.
Thank you. And I've come to realize that there's a real international David Bowie community that is a very welcoming community. And you're a celebrity within this community. And
I was in the ceremonies at the last convention, yes.
Yeah. So
yeah.
I wanted to ask you, when fellow Bowie fans or people who are plugged into this community meet you, how do they react?
I've had them react every single way you can imagine. Tears.
Yeah.
Freakouts.
Yeah.
A barrage of questions. But mostly it's beautiful, them telling me what I represented to them as a Bowie fan at that time, because so many of them were Bowie fans who go to these conventions at that time. And Cracked Actor was something that they were able to read and pass the DVD on to their friends or whatever. And I had a woman, a very lovely woman, tell me that she took the 2 copies from her library and would constantly have them in she was going to art school and constantly had them in a deck while she was learning her lessons in art school. So I've kind of impacted their lives as being somebody who was actually able to communicate in a way with David Bowie about their feelings about what he had done for them.
Yeah. And
And so
you actually did communicate with Bowie. He became aware of the clip and he used it in his own art. And how surreal is that? That the fandom itself becomes part of the artist's work.
I don't know. I mean, to me, it's just beyond belief. I have to pinch
Yeah.
myself daily because, like for instance, you interviewing me every day, I'm getting some sort of communication from people who it's made an impact on,
Yeah.
and I think that's just so beautiful. And I always treat them the way I would have wanted to be treated. Take
Yeah.
time, to talk to them. And it's been one of the most beautiful parts of my life,
Yeah.
in the past few years, is knowing that there's this community that still feels that really special way about David Bowie. And that was he let us feel accepted, and he
Yeah.
made us feel special, and he told us that we were wonderful in his songs. He kept saying, "You're not alone, you're wonderful, give me your hands." And
Yeah.
you know, I mean, for him to say that, then, I mean, Lady Gaga has since done it with her fans. Other people do it. But he was like the first person to really come out and tell us, you
Yeah.
know, that you're accepted. All the young dudes, for the young gay boy community was just credible, and then to come out with Rock and Roll Suicide, which is where he says, "Give me your hands,"
Yeah.
and you're not alone. I
You
mean,
know, I've always thought that it's interesting that unless you could think of one that I'm missing, that is the only song where Bowie directly says that you're not alone. And a lot of his songs are about isolation. Yet,
mm,
right? And yet, nonetheless, the impact that his message had on many of us is that message that you're not alone. Why do you think that resonated with those of us who might not have always felt like we fit in, or that we're that we're maybe out of place in our community? Why did that message come through, even though he only told us once that we're not alone?
well, I mean, he said it in different ways too. I mean, he in Quicksand, he talks about, how don't, just believe in yourself, don't deceive with belief, knowledge
Yeah.
comes with death's release. I mean, that was just a beautiful way of reaching out to us also, us confused kids or kids that
Yeah.
were having, trouble with just being who we were. But I think that's a good point about the isolation. I think at that time in Bowie's career, when he did write Rock and Roll Suicide and he told us, that we're not alone, he was he was not alone. I mean, he was coming out in many ways and shocking the world with his strangeness. And
Yeah.
then as fame approached and his drug use increased, I think he felt more isolated. At that point, he had created Ziggy, this monster, which he, killed off so, ceremoniously at the end of that Hammersmith tour.
Yeah.
And I just think that whatever he was doing was reflecting what he was going through, and
Yeah.
to tell us at the time and relate to us that, hey kids, hey, that's far out, so you heard it too. Like
Yeah.
you were that in that group of
Yeah.
people that were finding out things, and it was okay. So
Yeah.
so many of the songs, I think, at that time, both from Hunky Dory and both from Ziggy Stardust, and they made us feel like we were a part of something.
Yeah. And we had a chance to chat a little bit before we started recording this interview, and you were telling me about how when you were young and you were in Arizona, you were the New Yorker in Arizona, and I just it struck me that I was thinking about Crack Actor, where he's the Englishman in Los Angeles, where he seemed like he
Right.
was out of place. Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah. And
Yes.
yeah, so
Very hard.
at that point you were obsessed with Bowie. You're very young. You did not know that you were the star of this the co-star of this documentary, and you're becoming actually famous in Britain. But over the next couple of years, you channel your sort of rock and roll fandom into journalism. And so tell me about that and about Rock Magazine, which I have to say, I've never actually seen the magazine.
They do bits of it. It was part of a group of magazines that was done by Countrywide Publications. It was on Central Park South at a great office. And they would do like horse magazines and dog magazines and
Yeah.
alien magazines. And I was in charge of the rock magazines, which were, it gave me the opportunity to just really travel and meet people that I had admired and new people that I came to admire. But anyway, um, when one thing I knew when Alan Yentob interviewed me is I always wanted to be a writer, and I said, oh, I can do what he's doing, I
Yeah.
can be the person that is actually at an event and maybe talking to people. And I wanted, as I say in my book, I wanted my life to be full of music and microphones. And that's how I decided I would take my life. So I was always a writer. And my sister, who was dating a kind of a famous New York disc jockey, she's 11 years older than I am. And I would go visit, she stayed in New York, and I would visit her on my summers, and I would get to go to all of these rock events. So I was starting to feel very comfortable around the rock people. And I started submitting my pieces of work, which, as they say, kind of like Cameron Crowe did in Almost Famous. He
Yeah.
wanted to be in that scene, and that's kind of my story in a way. I started submitting pieces of my work to magazines. His was Rolling Stone. He did really well for himself. But so I started to get published at a very young age. And so I decided that I would go to New York and make this my career. And that's exactly what I did. I was very fortunate in being able to do that.
So at that point, and going forward, did you ever lose your sense of wonder, or are you talking to Iggy Pop, and you mentioned that you were hanging out with the New York Dolls, and were you thinking, is this real life? I mean,
I never lost it.
You never lost? Yeah.
I still feel I'm still that way. I
Yeah.
still feel like I'm that 16-year-old enthusiastic crazy girl who loves the whole scene. It's just a wonderful scene, with the right people in it. There are some people, like I had an experience with Lou Reed that will go down in my history as not being the most pleasant. But I think it's
What
because
happened?
he had a little bit of a bipolar thing going. But
Yeah.
most people were just lovely, and and I wasn't shy to ask them anything.
Yeah.
I found their comfort level, and I tried to go with it.
Did you ever get a chance to interview Bowie himself?
I never interviewed Bowie.
Yeah, but you
didn't
met him.
know when I had met him a couple of times. I did not know that I was the space cadet, unfortunately, because I didn't find out till about 10 years later. So whenever I was in a room with Bowie, I tried to be really cool, because there were so many people fawning on him that I did not want to be one of those people.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be part of the negativity that he might be feeling at the time, because, as you said, he became more isolated.
Yeah. So I want to come back to Bowie, but before we move off the New York rock scene of the 70s.
Oh my goodness.
Because of what you were doing, you were going to places that, most people have only heard of: Studio 54, CBGB's, I'm guessing the Mud Club. What was that whole scene like? I mean, how could you paint the picture? Yeah.
Well, okay. So at the time, there were two big scenes happening in New York, and I guess all around the world. There was the punk scene, which was like the anti-glamour, and I was into the glamour originally, and then I started getting into the punk scene, and I did work with the Dead Boys, for example, and then there was the disco scene. So many of the established rock acts, whether it be the Stones or Brian Ferry and Roxy Music, tried to come out with some sort of disco kind of single. So I'd be over at Studio 54 one part of the night, and then I'd head down in the subway and go to CBGB's for the rest of the night, or vice versa. And so it was just a really, two opposites hitting each other. It's a dynamic that I don't think has ever happened since. But at the time, there were brilliant artists popping up on the punk scene, even though they weren't necessarily punk, like Talking Heads,
Yeah.
And that was happening, and all this incredible music, and all these famous people would come down to CBGB's, and I'd meet film directors and movie stars, and because they wanted to slum and find out about that scene as well. So it was just brilliant. It was just unbelievable. And at that time, you could be poor in New York. You can afford You could have afforded a crummy apartment and gone to all these things. You know, if you looked artistic enough, they'd let you in, you know. But now it's a completely different kind of thing. You have to be rich to do
Oh
any of
yeah, I read about how I think I read something maybe about Debbie Harry before she was famous. I might be thinking of somebody else, but she had an apartment in the meatpacking district
it.
because it was so inexpensive.
I
Whereas
was there.
you were there
I
in the
interviewed
apartment.
her I interviewed her and Christine
Yeah,
in that just strewn with clothing kind of gross place, you
yeah,
know? And they were fascinating. And she was like, I'm never going to do this when I'm 40. I'm not going to do this, you know? And it was just hilarious because now she's in her 70s, almost 80 maybe, and she's still doing it. So
yeah.
I would love to show her that. But yeah, I still have
Eh,
that interview around. I should send it to you.
oh, please do. Yeah, no, that's fascinating because I think about there's so much to talk about, right? So first of all, Blondie wasn't Blondie at that time considered punk?
She was.
Yeah, and
But she
how
was
is that?
older than
Why?
most of the punks. She was a little bit older than most of the punks. She didn't look
Yeah,
it. But
yeah,
I'm going to tell you, of all the people that I met on the punk scene, she had to be one of the sweetest. All these little like punk kids and homeless kids, she would just like mother them. She would just like be so maternal and loving to them. It was just lovely to see
yeah,
that, just her charisma wasn't just in her incredible beauty. You know,
yeah,
she was luminescent. She was just one of the most beautiful people you'll ever look at, especially when she was young. But her nature was so loving and not judgmental. And she would just sort of like take care of the little girls. It was the sweetest. She's wonderful. She's just
yeah,
magnificent goddess.
yeah. Wow. And you can't, I don't know where. Like, I'm wondering if this is happening somewhere now because the meatpacking district in New York. You're right. And if you want to live there, you have to make a lot of money, and you're not
Oh
going to be
yeah,
a poor, aspiring artist at this point.
it's
So are
true.
they gathering anywhere? Is there some place somewhere in the country where this scene is happening today?
Well, I have a 25-year-old son who's very into music here in Los Angeles, and we live outside Los Angeles, but he goes in every weekend
Yeah,
to see these bands that I never heard of. And and it's like he becomes friends with a drummer or whatever. And, he goes to where the drummer's disc jockeying the next week or whatever. So there is definitely a scene. And it sounds to me more like a heavy metal meets like Black Sabbathy kind of music meets really interesting techno space out psychedelia.
yeah,
He likes the King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizards and the OCs. I can just start naming you Frankie and the Witch Fingers.
yeah,
All these kinds of music because he grew up with very eclectic music tastes, and now he takes them and he shows me music, and to me, like they sound like things I've heard before.
yeah. Wow.
So
Well,
there is definitely a scene, especially in Los Angeles.
40 years from now, he'll be talking to somebody about it.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
So, I think a lot of people who listen to music or they're fans of musicians, it's a very one-way relationship. They listen to the song, they buy the CD, they might go to the concert, but um, seldom do they imagine that they could interact with the artists. And I'm discovering something that you discovered a long time ago, which is that you can, and often the artists are very interested in talking to you about it.
Yeah.
And Bowie, he, I don't know how common this is, but he contemplates the relationship between the artist and the audience in many of his songs. From
Yes.
right from the kids killed the man and Ziggy Stardust to fashion or even somebody up there likes me. Is he talking about a politician or is he talking about a rock star? Right, and that, I mean, he's not talking, he's singing.
Talked about both constantly. He
Yeah,
sang both constantly. The
yeah, and I
Candidate
go ahead.
on, yeah, like the song "The Candidate"
Hmm.
on Diamond Dogs.
Yeah,
And there's always, and of course, he talks about Nixon and in Young Americans, and always had
yeah,
something to do with that. And also, not only that, but he talks about Winston Churchill
sure.
and other people like that. So
Yeah,
he always blended the two. and movie stars as well. The silver screen was big.
So that when he's talking about the silver screen or Winston Churchill, he's the audience, but then
Yes.
he's also commenting on his own audience. And I was thinking about
Yeah.
that when, you were telling me the story about Jump They Say, where, he takes from his own fan base
Hmm.
something that's become part of his legacy, and he works it into a remix of one of his own songs.
Well, they always called him, a little blue jay, because a blue jay steals things from, a shiny little thing, and he'll take it. And there's that famous story about uh, a Mick Jagger showing Bowie the Peely artwork,
Yeah,
from Rock Dreams, and saying, "We're going to do this on our next album cover," and then Bowie beats him to it. So he was a magpie, in taking all these things, but that's what artists do anyway. You
yeah,
know, I
yeah.
mean, I was lucky enough to be with my other idol, Andy Warhol, quite a bit when I was
Oh,
in
really?
New York in the 70s. Yeah.
Yeah,
And thanks to a good friend of mine, Liz Derringer. Hi, Liz. So I was able to watch him take things and to give things.
yeah.
So, I was sitting at a party with him right next to him, and I was wearing this beautiful bracelet that my brother had given me. My brother worked in Indian jewelry in Arizona, and he wanted to take it from me because he just took things from people. He's like, "Oh, I love that bracelet." I was like, "Yeah, can you take it off?" "Sure." "Can I have it?" "Oh, no." And then when he died, they found that he had cookie jars filled with like bracelets, watches, toys,
Yeah.
things he took from people.
Uh,
So that's what artists do. They take, whether it be ironically or actually physically.
yeah. Well, that is so magical. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and there's a wonderful modern art museum there. And my mother, when I was a child, would take me, and there was a big Andy Warhol Campbell soup can,
Oh, yeah.
which, of course, when I was a child, I thought it was the only one, right? But
You
I,
saw it.
yeah. But that, from I mentioned that because from as far back as I could think of, I thought of Andy Warhol as art, and so I don't have a question there. I'm just marveling that you
But
actually.
it's true. They do. They take their influences. You can't help
Yeah,
but be influenced by something.
yeah. So it's you mentioned Andy Warhol, who it remains iconic, and we're talking about David Bowie. I get the sense that David Bowie, there's more interest in him today than there maybe was 20 years ago while he was alive. Do you get that sense?
I think people are just starting to catch up with him.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
they never will, but he was such a unique artist.
Hmm.
And you'll never hear a bad story, about anyone who's ever met him because he treated everyone so brilliantly. Um, he was just so innovative. I think that sometimes people are born and it just shows right away. I'm sure you've met exceptional people that you just go, wow,
Yeah,
I just can't believe how this person is so evolved right now,
yeah, yeah,
and that's the way he was. And he was giving, he gave to us. He
yeah,
certainly gave to me. He gave me an education um, that I probably never would have had otherwise, because I was so interested in him and his references that educated me both spiritually and educationally, art wise.
yeah,
It had me reading things that I probably never would have bothered to read. You know, um, he was just, he just sort of built me almost. His influence grew me
yeah.
like a crystal in some liquid.
Now, when you say you were reading things you wouldn't necessarily read, is that in part because of the literary references in his songs?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes, and then conversations he had. One of the most influential interviews I read with him was the very famous interview he did with William Burroughs
yeah,
uh, in Rolling Stone.
yeah,
And that just came to me at an incredible place. He talked about everything from white noise, which I had never heard of before, and
yeah,
concepts. I think he and Burroughs were trying to one up each other in a way now when I reread it. But the things that they threw out there were just like so tasty morsels for someone like me and so many others. We went,
yeah,
wait a minute, what's that about?
yeah,
So yes, 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 yes.
yeah. So somebody you interviewed who was close to Bowie, who is another example of somebody who might on the surface not seem like an approachable or even friendly person, but everything that I've heard about him is that he's actually very friendly, is Iggy Pop.
Yes.
So, and you've interviewed him a few times, is that correct?
Yeah, I've interviewed him for my magazine,
Yeah.
for Circus Magazine,
Yeah.
somebody else. Yeah. And lots of times you can take bits from each interview. They don't mind if you do that. But it was when he was just coming out of Berlin. He had just done Lust for Life, and he had worked with Bowie quite closely, lived with him too. And he spoke German really well. And due to my heritage, I understand it. So we were playing around with that a little bit at the very beginning of the conversation, and he made me feel extremely comfortable. And he's just fun,
Yeah.
he was just fun and funny and charming, and and no pretension at all. As you can see now when he's interviewed, there's just not a speck of pretension on that man at all. So,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's what he was then too.
Yeah. That's great. How do I get in touch with him?
I wouldn't know now.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
That's me in 19. Let's go back to the 80s, and I can
Yeah.
maybe help you.
All right. Okay. Wow. That's funny. I had the incredible experience of interviewing Kevin Armstrong,
I
who,
love Kevin.
yeah, and he
Hi,
wrote,
Kevin.
yeah, I think he's going to watch this. So he wrote a memoir, and there's this story where he was playing for Iggy Pop at a low point in Iggy Pop's career, and he says that the opening performance of a tour was at a restaurant, and it was, and the like the sandwich board in front of the restaurant said halibut special and Iggy Pop.
Well, that's a great story. He also told me a story where he said that you think that Iggy is just all over the place, but
Yeah,
he's not. It's very
yeah,
orchestrated. And when the song started, like the band knew when to end it, when it
yeah,
began, what his moves were going to be. I mean, it
yeah.
was like intensely much more complicated than one would think it was.
Yeah, it's I'm always impressed by professionalism and that type of thing.
Yes.
I I I think I remember a similar story in his book, and it seems Iggy Pop in particular seems so impulsive, right? That's,
Right.
you're watching him and he's jumping all over the place, but it's not impulsive at all. But that's a sign of his professionalism. I actually once, I don't have the experience you do with music, but I um uh twice was backstage, once for Pearl Jam, a Pearl Jam concert,
Uh-huh.
and once was for Natalie Merchant. And
Oh, I love them both. Yeah.
yeah, and the Natalie Merchant, the backstage, it was so clean. It was so the opposite of what you imagine. People were, there's nobody was smoking, nobody was drinking. It was like a hospital, but
Yeah.
very professional. And the Pearl Jam, so I'm backstage, and the people I'm with were watching them on stage, and on stage they're acting like they're just about able to stand up, and then between songs that come out, and it was clear that that was all an act, and they would sort of cross
Huh.
notes, um again, it's like the professionalism was evident when you get a little peek behind the scenes.
Yes. I've been lucky to be on tour with so many different bands, from Supertramp, the Kinks. Um,
Wow.
I could tell you just Aerosmith. I could
Yeah.
just a whole bunch of them that like even Jim Dandy. I've got so many
Yeah.
crazy bands, but they are all usually very professional. But I have to tell you a story about Iggy and Bowie. I was so fortunate to go to a performance that Iggy Pop did. It's kind of famous now, where Bowie played the keyboards in a plaid
Yeah.
shirt and
Yeah.
didn't face the audience once. And it was just the keyboard player and just let Iggy do his thing. And that to me just spoke volumes about Bowie. You know, he just
And
wanted,
you saw that performance?
I did. I
Yeah.
did. It
Was
was,
Bowie identified?
no,
Yeah, but you
no,
knew he
not
was
that I
there.
recall. No, but we knew it was,
Yeah.
but it was spectacular to kind
Yeah.
of see Iggy just really, going at it, and Bowie just, being
Yeah.
just a member of the band.
So you've seen some really not just iconic performers, but actual iconic shows.
Oh
Even
yeah,
going back to the Diamond Dogs concert that you were saying,
yeah.
again, correct me if I'm wrong. That was not properly filmed. There's like little clips of
No,
of that, but
no.
you can't bust out a DVD and see it. See it. Is that correct?
No, no. If you want to talk Bowie film, I think the best person to talk to is Nacho.
Yes.
Michael Marshall, you should really talk to him. He knows everything about every piece of film that's everywhere in the world. He's just, an encyclopedia of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's a fabulous guy. But as far as we know, no, we'd love to get our
Yeah.
hands on it. The only person that would have it would be the BBC. And I did spend some time with Alan Yentob this summer. So grateful for it. I saw him 50 years after I had originally met him. And I got to spend some time with him. And nobody knows where that is. Nobody
Yeah.
knows where that is.
It's
That
amazing.
footage, the
Yeah.
lost footage. I would love to see it.
Wow. So this has been terrific. I'm just going to ask you a couple more questions, but what can you tell us? I don't think it's out yet. What could you tell us about your memoir?
I think people are going to find it amusing
Yeah.
because I like to add fun into whatever I'm doing. And I think it's going to be very relatable to not just a Bowie fan, but perhaps to fans of anyone,
Yeah.
that feel obsessed by maybe a Taylor Swift or something.
Yeah.
And I hope it's visual in your
Yeah.
mind,
Yeah.
and the chapters are lyrics from Bowie songs, Bowie lyrics. And I put, well, I start the book off, I talk about my childhood for a little bit, but it really starts off when I became obsessed with Bowie at age 12. So it's a what we call a fan more,
Yeah.
calling
Yeah.
it a fan more from the age of 12 to 14.
Yeah.
So it's 2 years in the life of like an obsessive fan, which you might find, a girl with Taylor Swift right now, or Chappell Rowan, or whatever it might be. But my object of my, infatuation was this ethereal, incredible person,
Yeah. So
man,
look, I'm going to
God.
ask you an esoteric question, and
Yeah,
then I'll wrap up. Well, I've got two real questions,
go
and then
for it.
I'll wrap up with the sort of a silly question. So the esoteric question is this: so why do we do this? Why are we fans? What function does that play in our lives? What does it do for us to be fans?
I think if that's a great question. I think that it makes us feel part of something when we're
Yeah.
not part of anything.
Yeah.
you know, whether it's something that you can relate to with someone else,
Yeah.
something that the artist is reaching out to you, you can find meaning in what they're doing. It's kind of like a religious, it's a
Yeah.
spiritual religious experience to start knowing who you are. And that's how it was for me. He took me on a spiritual journey as well through his occultism and his Buddhism, and everything in between is Eastern philosophy. He had wanted to be a Buddhist monk. I went through all of that in those 2 years on a spiritual journey. So I think it helps us define who we are and connect with others as well
Yeah.
as others, just community.
I was thinking that connection that you mentioned, it spans time and space, right? So
Sure.
I'm talking to you from New York and you're in Los Angeles, and this exercise, which has been just enormously fun and rewarding, has taken me, to Japan and to Australia and to Ukraine. I interviewed somebody who's
Wow.
organizing a Bowie show in Ukraine while Kyiv was under threat of war,
Yes.
right? And if you think about it, people saw Bowie in the 60s. And so time and space, there's not a place on earth and there's not a time, going back to the 60s where there wasn't the opportunity to connect with, like, that's the point of commonality.
Well, if I meet a Bowie fan, it's like instinctive, certain things about them,
Yeah.
that they're accepting,
Yeah.
right? That they're non-judgmental,
Yeah.
that they're open to different forms of sexual genders. They're
Yeah.
not going to be shocked by any of that. There's just like this openness, like that beautiful nebula behind you, that we're all together.
Yeah.
And as
Yeah.
much as hippy dippy as that sounds, that's what I believe in my heart. And when I know I'm talking to another Bowie person, it's like, okay, you're part of the tribe, you're part of the family.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can have a great conversation.
Yeah. That's wow. So
Mhm.
let me ask you this. When that memoir is published, would you come back? Would you give
I'd
me
love
another?
to.
Oh, wonderful. Great. So here's my silly question, which is I ask everybody at the end of the interview. So what is your favorite Bowie song and album?
Gosh, that's a really hard question. When I was younger, it would have to be between, let me see. I really related to Rebel Rebel when I
Yeah.
was, I thought he was talking to me like a lot of the boys I knew were talking. He was talking through all the young dudes.
Yeah.
And now I'm really into Station to Station, the whole album. I
Yeah.
was in the late 70s, early 80s when that came out. I was really into it, and I've come back really into it. The actual song of Station to Station, meaning that he's gone from station to station, that by the Kabbalah, you
Yeah.
know, um, from Kether to Malkuth. That means a lot to me spiritually. Um, and then he just comes out and says, it's not the side effects of cocaine. I'm
Yeah.
thinking that it must be love, but is it too late? And just all of those things mean a different thing to me than it did then as
Yeah.
I'm getting older.
Yeah.
And it brings some retrospection, and it brings a lot of joy. So I play that an awful lot these days.
Yeah. Wow. That's
Station
great.
to Station is just a masterpiece to me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
It's one of the
terrific.
best singing he's done, honestly.
Yeah.
Like Wild as the Wind. That's just gorgeous.
Yeah. That's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Hannah Breschard, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And if I could close by saying something, you are the commander now. So thank
Oh,
you.
oh,
Thank you.
can I
Yes.
can I just add one more thing that I meant
Yes.
to say to you? My sister did meet him years later after she knew that he knew that I was the space cadet.
Yeah.
And so she said, my sister is the space cadet. He goes, really? What's she doing now? And at the time I was living on an organic apple orchard. He goes, oh, she's a hippie. And he goes, so am I. And he winked at her.
That's great. Hannah Breschard, thank you so much for joining me. I'm looking forward to the memoir, and I'm glad we made the connection. Let's stay in touch.
Cheers. Peace on earth.
Thank